Thank you, Luca, for that kind introduction. Do I have to speak up, or is so there's no speaker, right, Luca? I just speak loud?
Yeah,
speak loud. Okay, all right. It's great to be here, and thank you for for coming on such a nice day with spring finally here, and I'm sure you'd rather be doing other things. So it's very, very kind of you to come. I'm going to read, and at times I'm also going to extemporize, and we'll leave time for questions at the end. So the patrimony of Europe's art and architecture weighs on the Italian peninsula with a particular heft. Surprisingly to many, Italy is in fact a younger country than even the relatively newborn United States. Even after its belated unification in 1861, in shaping a modern national identity, Italy appealed to the trappings of its distinguished past, erecting monuments in the style of exalted Roman and Renaissance traditions. What other European nation had such illustrious precedents to draw upon? What better way to insist upon the new nation's modern relevance than to call attention to its former glories? As in so many European countries, the turn of the 20th century gradually saw a wide swath of structures enlivened with newer tendencies imported from France and Austria, most notably Art Nouveau and Secessionism, styles which Italian architects fashioned into a local strand of what they call liberty, as we see here. From Palermo to Turin, across the peninsula, examples of liberty employed not only relatively new materials such as glass and iron, but projects which integrated the entire edifice, from curtains to cabinets, staircases to door handles, in a unified design. Architecture's fundamental operation and orientation, however, remain largely unchanged. Note how the entrance here remains a habitual doorway, symmetrical and frontal. In other words, even if the surfaces of these buildings became decorated with visually pleasing, exciting motifs, their function, whether public or residential, persisted intact, albeit with more adventurous trimmings. With F.T. Marinetti's Futurist revolution, which Luca just mentioned, nothing was to remain intact, least of all the spatial coordinates of daily life. Time and space died yesterday, writes F.T. Marinetti, the Futurist founder, in his 1909 founding and manifesto of Futurism, with which I'm sure at least a part of this crowd is already familiar. Even as he launched his text from Paris, as you can tell, Marinetti proclaimed a new Italian order, one which would make over this chiefly agrarian backwater, which Italy was still seen as in the early 20th century, into a nexus of cultural innovation. As the ever-expanding movement engulfed every imaginable medium and phenomenon, from clothing to theater to music and poetry to a manifesto of futurist women, as you can see at the bottom right, it was inevitable that its adherents turned to revising the built environment. Though the futurists took urbanism and the city as the very crucible of modernity, they repeatedly attacked so-called museum cities and celebrated the throbbing boulevards of Paris and Milan. It was some years before they produced any comprehensive ideas regarding actual architecture. As the group's most incisive theorist, Umberto Boccioni, painter and sculptor, finally authored a manifesto of futurist architecture in 1914, which stemmed in many ways from his aesthetic experiments in drawing, painting, and sculpture. Sculptures here, such as Boccioni's Development of a Bottle in Space from 1913, reveal a fundamentally architectural concern for how his objects exist in and interact with their surrounding space. So even a bottle, as it sits on a table, Boccioni insisted, is interpenetrated by various angles, by the lines of the table on which it sits. Even your bodies, as they sit on these chairs, are intersected by the geometries that compose the chair, right? There was a sudden interpenetration of art making and philosophy, which insisted upon even still and static objects as bound up with their environment in ways that we hadn't even thought about. And as we'll see, at some point later on, Futurists actually designed, when they designed some of their chairs and objects, they at one point thought that they might design mobili a sorpresa, so chairs which would have tacks on them, so that when you sat down, you actually couldn't sit down, right? You would be prodded back into action. So the Futurists, as we'll see, had a very kind of ambivalent relationship with objects, because objects are fundamentally static, and Futurism was, of course, all about motion and movement, as you can tell from Boccioni's bottle. Not surprisingly, Boccioni's little discussed manifesto of architecture uses prominent futurist watchwords like dynamism and simultaneity, while also denouncing what he calls the twin enslavements of Greco-Roman architectural orders on the one hand and harmful foreign influence on the other. Italian art and architecture had to liberate itself from its own past glories, the Futurists insisted, and from the present sway of European trends. Aiming at a quote-unquote modern architecture of universal style, Boccioni called for an increased functionalism and utilitarianism in terms which strikingly anticipate rationalist architecture and its famous anthem, "Form follows function." It was a younger practicing draftsman, however, who Marinetti tapped as Futurism's official architect, ignoring the efforts not only of Boccioni, but of his contemporary Enrico Prampolini. Working out of a design office in Milan beginning in 1913, Antonius Antonia had already assimilated Art Nouveau tendencies long employed by other established architects. Exhibited as part of the Nuove Tendenze group, his innovative series of drawings presented under the aegis of the Città Nuova, or the New City, drew Marinetti's attention, and he tapped Santelia to publish an architectural manifesto. The apparent tranquility of Santelia's cityscapes, comprised of soaring trains and power stations, threaded with elevators and funiculars, belies the features specified in his manifesto, a ceaseless mobility which would defy the inertia normally associated with architecture. Adapted in part from projections of New York's urban future, Santelia's plans imagine an Italy and perhaps a world stripped of history and ceaselessly rebuilt with each generation. Not one of Santelia's designs was ever realized. Killed during World War I at the age of 28, he left behind an array of mesmerizing plans which, though unrealized, transformed the 20th century architectural imagination. Every generation must build its own city, Santelia proclaims in his manifesto, and his concepts echoed far beyond the purview of his immediate generation, from the work of his associate Mario Chiattone to rationalist designers to a 1930s fascist architectural journal published in his name and in his shadow. The futurist Virgilio Marchi's architectural renderings sidestep the more sober lines of Santelia's cities for delirious, almost hallucinatory spaces. Marchi's imagined futurist cities, which seem like something straight out of Disney, were in fact first conceived as set designs for the theater, and he proved consistent in designing actual theatrical and cinema designs far into the 20th century, contributing to over 60 films in his career. Those architectural projects which he did complete in the 20s were actual theaters, like the Teatro degli Indipendenti, the independent theater in Rome. Unlike Santelia's cityscapes, as you can tell, many of them include the teeming masses and vehicles and thrumming bodies which Marchi envisaged inhabiting their spaces. With pinched arches and pierced volumes, Marchi's structures appear redolent of both Gothic organicism, and a certain New Age mysticism, evident in his creation of Earth and Sky. On the right, Wenzel Hableck's designs from the 1920s in this kind of New Agey, mystical vein. He was interested in crystals, and this is all about kind of transcendence and passage to a new plane. And when you see how much they have in common architecturally, it gives you a sense that Futurism, for all of its interest in mechanization, in technology, etc., also had some very kind of flighty, mystical, metaphysical tendencies as well. But just as Hableck here on the right adapted his fantasies to the necessities of building during the 1920s, so Marchi produced designs with more rational applications. And so we see how a lot of these artists, as much as they're imagining incredibly fantastic, hallucinatory designs, which seem like they were taking LSD as they're making them, they're then imagining how some of these spaces might actually be someday built. Marchi's cities are plainly the stuff of fantasy, more like sets for theater than architectural design. Sant'Elia's on the right prove no less elusive in their scale and their detail. How would these things actually be built? And the notion of interpenetration developed by Boccioni and others seems hardly amenable to the practicalities of architectural construction, despite the excitement of spaces continually agitating, coming apart and coming together. But what then would futurist modernity look like? Modern art and architecture imagined in the early 20th century transforming not simply painting within their frames, but the very basic everyday coordinates of daily life. Art into life, this is the term often invoked to describe this modernist avant-garde drive, this utopic desire for aesthetics to serve not just as a mirror of history, but as its engine, its motor, its model. Consider one of Giacomo Balla's early futurist paintings, a rendering of speed and sound, two consummately intangible phenomena. How do we picture speed and sound as images? Yet note how even this depiction spills over the canvas's frame. These abstract forms seem to want to rejoin the world and to transform its very surfaces and substances in the process. It is thus less surprising that a more comprehensive approach to the built environment emerged in Balla and Fortunato de Pero's manifesto, The Futurist Reconstruction of the Universe, in 1915. As its title would suggest, the manifesto proposed nothing less than a, quote, total fusion in order to reconstruct the universe. The two artists set out a program of unprecedented, if entirely unrealistic, ambition, which became a touchstone for decades of experimentation in Italy. They called not only for the decomposition of plastic volumes, illustrated by certain objects and assemblages in the text, they also called for a restructuring of lived space in its most basic dimensions. Already a prominent painter, Balla turned his talents to imagining a world now not simply in 2 dimensions, but also 3 and even 4. Illustrating their manifesto with these various experiments, Balla and De Pero proposed transforming everything from architecture and toys to clothing and furniture. Now lost, these multimedia objects appear hardly functional. Titled plastic complexes, they seem aimed at trying out different materials in new articulations, from string to cardboard. Here's the string. Some of them include, this one includes fragments of mirror appended to different surfaces, along with this wire, which has a good deal in common with Boccioni's spiral bottle, right? Which, as many people, for those of you who ever visited the Guggenheim Museum in New York, right? Frank Lloyd Wright's spiral staircase. A number of people have pointed out how that dynamic, evolving form of the spiral, which takes your body in a kind of in this sort of vortex, is related to Boccioni's bottle, which is clearly in some ways in dialogue here with Balla's sculpture. At least one of Depetto's objects here on the bottom right was actually kinetic. It was animated by a motor, entirely in keeping with the futurist insistence upon motion, mobility, and activism. Art would no longer sit still, it would be part of life. If these assemblages here seem inoperable, both artists set about concretizing their imaginations in the form of actual practical objects. To hear even the range of these objects gives a sense of their enterprise, their drive to ground futurist principles in an objecthood of the everyday. Living room screens, ties, women's purses, coat racks, bookshelves, shoes, coat hangers, tapestries, end tables. While Boccioni's bottle afforded not even the containment of liquid, Depetto would come to design actual bodies for the Campari Liquor Company, a collaboration which witnessed him develop everything from poster design to entire architectural pavilions at the right. Depetto, in fact, proved one of the most marketable artistic forces between the world wars in Italy. Both Balla and Depetto sketched pieces of furniture, and both reimagined clothing in futurist terms, from the waistcoat to entire suits. And as I was preparing for this lecture, I had to chuckle at the availability online of Balla for the well-dressed baller. This sort of importation now of Balla and futurism even to clothing sold under the notion of being a kind of swaggering futurist baller. And a caricature from New York in 1914 imagines the bodies of gallery goers transformed by the modernist images on display. As you can tell here, the critic Walt Kuhn seems suddenly, his overcoat is somehow infected or converted by the very works that he's looking at, anticipating precisely the fashion designs subsequently proposed by Balla. If clothes make the man, as the saying goes, then the futurists believed that even dress habits could contribute to this renewed sensibility of living. Of course, clothes may be said to make the woman as well. And despite the futurist movement's frequently misogynist politics and posturing, numerous women artists contributed to futurist painting and literature as well. Depetto's tapestries, in fact, were woven by numerous craftswomen, many of whom have remained anonymous, which is all too often the case when modernist male artists set about applying aesthetics to actual design. And this is the case in a number of early 20th century instances where male artists think about realizing actual objects as craft objects. And they, in many instances, lean upon fellow female artists who have worked in that domain and oftentimes remain anonymous, whereas the sort of canonical great genius male artist gets a lot of the credit. As you can see from Balla's field of futurist flowers, even the natural environment would cede to this universal futurist conversion. Balla and Depetto, in fact, speak in their manifesto of futurist flora and animals, carrying the question of design to a somewhat absurd extreme. Did remaking the universe in the futurist image entail rendering even the organic world as something synthetic? Consider that Balla actually came to name his very daughters themselves after modern technology. He named his daughter Propeller and Light. And I'm actually not making this up, I wish I were. But imagine being named Propeller in early 20th century Italy. A photograph from the period reads, Balla marries a chair and a stool is born, not too far of a stretch from his actual personal assimilation of artistic design to his very family. Balla and De Pero's insistence upon toys and play anticipate certain elements of Dada, launched in Switzerland the following year during World War I. But whereas Dada aimed to counter practicality with an assault upon art as an institution, Futurism still clung to certain canons of beauty and usefulness. Indeed, what we call second Futurism, the flowering of Futurism between the world wars, particularly under the fascist regime, ushered in a widespread application of aesthetics to what we would now call design. Italy produced no centralized art or design school during the 1920s to rival, for example, Germany's Bauhaus or the Russian avant-garde in Moscow. Yet, Italian artists and designers in many cases assimilated European avant-garde tendencies in keeping with this integrated reimagining of space. And we speak of this in design culture today as architects or designers who occupy themselves with everything from the spoon to the city, right? From ashtrays to architecture. That is, in some ways, when we think of design culture, it's the idea that the architect is able to design not merely a skyscraper, but the couches that sit in the lobby, right? Or the curtains that go along with it. That's what design firms and teams do now. They imagine an entire world. The building is not simply a container, but it also, every aspect of it is integrated into a kind of unified design, right? And so, under fascism, Giuseppe Terragni, one of the most prominent rationalist architects, uses the functionalism of the building's pierced facade to allude to fascism's supposed transparency. Mussolini once said, fascism is a glass house, right? Meaning, fascism has nothing to hide, it's entirely transparent. And here that is almost literalized in this design, which now to us today looks almost like a parking garage. But in the 1930s, this was revolutionary, this use of modern materials like concrete, the way the facade is actually, there's a courtyard inside which is open up to the air. You can't really even tell where the entrance is, right? The facade is not load-bearing, which means it's not propping up the weight of the building. And if the building's interior revealed some relatively conventional walls and decorations, other areas, such as its main meeting room, incorporated abstract geometric murals by the painter Mario Radice, integrated entirely with this architecture of rationalist simplicity. Terragni even designed the chrome tubular chairs for the building, an embrace of modern materials and form in sync with the most advanced European tendencies. In the same vein, the artist Ernesto Tayat's model for a mass-produced jumpsuit, the tuta, in 1920, and you see here he actually produced an English language version of it in Florence, recalls Russian constructivist efforts, such as that by the great European Russian avant-gardist Alexander Rodchenko, who is modeling here his design for workers' clothing. For the Russian avant-garde, workers' clothes, as you can imagine in the wake of the Russian Revolution, formed an important basic object of revolutionary change of the everyday. But so too did it for Giacomo Balla, who, after his design of futurist suits in the 1910s and early 20s, went on to design future fascist wear. And you can see here it says future fascist. This is a future fascist sweater. So what does it mean to design clothing for in the name of an ideology, right? Rodchenko here is purposefully wearing workers' clothes, which means he identifies himself with the proletariat, with the factory worker. The artist is a laborer as well. And so what does it mean for our clothing, even our clothing itself, to speak a kind of ideology? And that's something we would have to think about with regard to, and of course, what's significant also about this jumpsuit? What stands out about it? About its colors in particular? Fire and flames and those sort of futurist geometry, but what else? What's that?
They're lighter colors.
It's also the colors of the Italian flag. So you're literally sort of wearing your patriotism and your sort of national pride on your sleeve. So in fact, Balla and DePedo, their commitment in their manifesto to, quote, fighting and to war emerged in the same lines as their dedication to a sense of play. And in fact, both Balla and DePedo put their work in the service of the fascist cause well into the 1930s. Even still, the mix of whimsy and play in Balla and DePedo's project cannot be discounted, nor can their influence upon a wide range of approaches to design. Though never proposing serial or mass production in the vein of industrial design, Balla's own prolific Casa d'Arte, or House of Art in Rome, served throughout the 1920s and 30s as a nexus of experiments for a wide range of artists. And you can tell how he's transformed every surface, from bookshelf to windowsill, into a kind of living, throbbing work of art. And this is the case with a lot of artist spaces in the early 20th century, from Mondrian to others. This idea that suddenly it's not simply the canvas that you're painting which is transformed, but everything around it. The canvas becomes a kind of launching pad for the world itself to be transformed. Balla's painted wooden furniture suggests at once an application of futurism to functional ends and a devotion to the movement's original impulse. After all, the word for a piece of furniture in Italian is a mobile. It's a piece of, essentially mobili means furniture. And that is of course related to our word in English, mobile. Literally something moved or movable. And before going on, just to give you a sense of one example of the influence of something like Balla's project here, before going on to practice as what was called an aero painter, a painter of views taken from airplanes, evoking flight and technology, the artist Tatto himself developed what was called this Casa d'Arte, right? This sort of house of art. And you can tell that it entailed not just painted murals on the walls, but also a futurist couch, futurist end tables. And he actually, and here we see some more of these various furnishings. He went on as well in the 1930s to design furniture for the fascist aviator and politician Italo Balbo, which merged his penchant for furniture design and futurist and fascist motifs of flight. The asymmetrical thrust and diagonals of these side tables, couch, ottoman, and mirror, produced for Balbo's house, reveal, like Balla's designs before them, Tatto's dedication to these animating asymmetrical lines, which shrug off any sense of stasis or sitting still. Compare one of DePedo's frames on the left for his portrait of Marinetti with Tatto's mirror on the right. Each one reconciles the diagonal drive so dear to futurist aesthetics with a practical verticality, right? So the futurists loved diagonal lines. Why? Why would they prefer diagonal as opposed to horizontal and vertical? Movement, right? The diagonal means that something is in the process of moving. If something is diagonal, it has to either fall forward or back, right? Whereas horizontal and vertical is associated with stasis and solidity. So the diagonal appears in nearly every example of futurist painting and sculpture, but they actually started, as you can tell, incorporating this into actual design objects. And so the mirror here has essentially has it both ways. It is at once incorporating the diagonal, but it's still functionally vertical here. To be sure, not all futurist furniture design managed to maintain this sense of exciting, aggressive dynamism. Consider here Gerardo Dottori's dining room, which gets back in a certain sense to this Art Nouveau incorporation of decorative motifs in a way that really does not lend any sense of movement or dynamism. Its diagonals, as you can tell, are actually incorporated into entirely symmetrical design. So Marinetti hated symmetry, because symmetry, just like horizontal and vertical, is about stasis and order and predictability. And so this is just by way of saying that there were examples into the 30s of works that are vaguely, they're almost like paying lip service to these futurist motifs without actually lending any sense of real kind of motion or change or activism. And of course, a dining room is a fundamentally middle-class space, right? And we don't typically associate the avant-garde with middle-class domestic culture. There are examples where that association, that site of middle-class domestic creature comforts here could be sort of shaken up a little bit. But that's not always the case. And just by way of conclusion and thinking about the legacies of the futurist object and its assimilation into not only the European avant-garde but contemporary culture, in 1925 in Paris there was held the exhibition of art décoratif, and this is where we get the term Art Deco from, right? So I started out with Art Nouveau, which is those sort of incorporates natural motifs of vegetation and organic forms, and Art Deco comes about 20 or 30 so years later, and we get that from Art décoratif, right? So it's a short for decorative arts. And the pavilion, as it appeared in Paris, incorporated these seemingly futurist trees, which prompted Balla, when he arrived at the pavilion, to write back to his colleagues in Italy, and essentially to say that Futurism has taken over Paris. That's it. We've essentially won. We have conquered the avant-garde, basically. And while this was, of course, not acknowledged by the French themselves, and it should be said that in the 20s there was both a kind of sympathy and rivalry between France and Italy. They fought on the same side in World War I and considered themselves Latin brothers in a certain sense, but there was always a sense of rivalry between the cultural greatness of France and of Italy. But this, of course, did not stop Balla and his colleagues from declaring essentially that that these other avant-gardes were falling into step with Futurism. And he certainly could have made a case for the precedent of this notion of a kind of synthetic nature originating in Futurism. And the afterlife of Futurist design, as Professor Cotini signaled at the start, is one that is ongoing. This is a recent adaptation of Depetto's study for an armchair, which during his lifetime was never realized. But of course we can trace a lot of these echoes in ways that are not necessarily explicit or declared. So even in the 1980s, designs like Ettore Sozzas's shelf here, which violates Futurism in, again, this return to a kind of almost decorative symmetry, and yet by incorporating these playful colors, clearly pays debt in some ways to that Futurist precedence. And the incorporation of Futurism, which has, as you probably could tell thus far, a relatively problematic relationship with fascism, right? The Futurist legacy in Italy is haunted in some ways by the fact that during the 20 years of fascism between the world wars, most elements, most artists, designers, architects actively supported, or at least in no way dissented from the regime. So oftentimes when we think about and look about at Futurism, we have to look at it from both the formal aesthetic angle, but also the political one, right? What does it mean to actively support a regime, and how is that borne out in the actual work itself? In some ways, these legacies have been either forgiven or ignored slightly. This is the Italian 20-cent euro coin, and this is, on the right here, we have an image of Balla's sculpture called Boccioni's Fist. Boccioni is the artist who made this sculpture, and here, in a very, as you can tell, sort of similar design, evoked his futurist colleague here as a series of conglomerate of abstract shapes. And this is now on one of these Italian postage stamps. So in some ways, Futurism has been absorbed into the cultural bloodstream, separate from some of its political and ideological baggage. And this is the case not only in Italy, but in terms of the term Futurism itself. So you can buy Futurist lipstick from Estee Lauder, and what exactly remains of the actual particular Italian case of Futurism is, of course, up for argument. But perhaps we can talk about that now. Oh, sure.
And there's plenty to discuss. So if you have any questions, we have some time now.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting. So thank you very much for being here and for your talk. I'm really interested in a sort of tension I'm getting from some of this between production and producers. And in particular, I was thinking about the contrast between the futurist clothing you showed and the design from, I'm going to butcher the Russian name, Rodchenko.
Oh, Rodchenko, yeah.
Rodchenko, yeah. So, on the one hand, you've got this sort of like celebration of like the proletariat, the worker, and the producer. And then on the other hand, you have these sort of futurist nods to production, such as, I caught a very industrial look at the Santelia, some of the Santelia designs, and such as this use of synthetics and this sort of thing, while at the same time sort of like, shutting out producers, as you talked about with the women doing the weaving, the workshop. So I don't know, I just thought it was an interesting theme, and I wondered if that was something that you wanted to say more about, because
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah. Well, like Italy and Russia were both seen as the two of the most quote unquote backward nations in the early 20th century. So in some ways, this really kind of overactive concern with design, with modernity, stemmed from that fact. So Sant'Elia's designs are done at a time where nothing in Milan, where he was working, looked remotely like this, right? Milan was basically the one industrial city in Italy in the early 19th century, or early 20th century. And its factories, the few that it had, were not anything on the order of what he was imagining. So that sense of industrial production that we're getting is an exaggerated one, right? In terms of production and producer, it's a great question because it opens on to the question of authorship, right? A lot of what we would call sort of progressive avant-garde art of the 20th century, artists were starting to say, you know what, I don't even necessarily need to sign my work, right? Artists were in some ways, like the Russian avant-gardists, working in sync with industrial production and getting away from the notion of the artist as an individual genius. So Rodchenko thought of himself as working for a collective that was, he no longer thought of himself as the genius artist on the order of someone like Picasso or Van Gogh. And in fact, eventually he was no longer painting. He renounced painting entirely. Painting was seen as a kind of bourgeois pastime, something for the ruling classes, as was this idea of the individual genius. So he absolutely was associating himself with a kind of producer on an industrial, in an industrial vein, precisely in order to identify with a collective larger than himself. And his wife, I mean, that's another thing. The Russian avant-garde is fascinating because women artists in the Russian avant-garde were some of the most active and mesmerizing artists practicing. There was, unlike in Italy, they had a kind of status as artists, as comrades, basically, of real kind of equality. And that notion of a sort of collective effort, particularly in the realm of women artists. So his partner, Varvara Stepanova, one of the most interesting artists of the early 20th century, and she was designing clothing, as was Rodchenko. So this association of the artist with, as producer, that's a fascinating. There's in fact a book on the early 20th century Russian avant-garde by an art historian named Maria Goff called "The Artist as Producer." So it's a great question.
And do you think the Italian futurists then are like rejecting that sort of producer identity, or do you think
They
they're...
still clung to the idea of the individual sort of genius.
Yeah.
They never really renounced fully painting. They all still paint. Part of it was about the sort of braggadocio of particularly Italian genius, and I think some of that stemmed from this inferiority complex of, we're coming from this quote-unquote backward nation, and so we have to overcompensate. But I think, the idea of the individual artist having a kind of vision still remained in Futurism in a sense. Yeah. Good questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really wonderful. I'm wondering why a lot of the Italian futurist artists and architects were so attracted to fascism when, at least in hindsight and our understanding now, the fascists so much wanted to go back to kind of rebuilding the empire and everything. And at least to me, those designs are very much not.
It's a good question, and I think that's why it's so important that we teach this stuff. So under Italian fascism, there were certain elements of there were fascist groups that were called the avanguardisti, for example, which means the avant-garde, right? Mussolini considered fascism a revolution, so fascist culture was actually very tolerant of modernist avant-garde culture. It's something a lot of people don't know about, but for example, this in Nazi Germany in the late 30s would have been unthinkable, right? Or for example, these abstraction. In Nazi Germany, you could essentially be interned in a camp for painting something like that. Under Mussolini, and as you can tell, the abstraction is still associated with the Duce, right? But under Mussolini, they tolerated a certain pluralism of culture, as long as it called itself fascist, as long as it pledged allegiance to the regime. They actually thought that more dynamic examples of art and architecture could only contribute to the regime. So you had some architects and artists who said this is degenerate and foreign, this has nothing Italian about it. Real Italian culture is the Colosseum and the great glories of our past, which we need to sort of use as models for rebuilding. But at the same time, in the 30s, you have things like this being built. So you're absolutely right to imagine, so just, to give you an example of that, where is so just an example of how these things could be reconciled, right? This is one of the most famous buildings built under fascism, which, as you can tell, and in fact in Italian it's called the Square Colosseum, because it's a sort of modern fascist version of the Colosseum. So here is the regime saying, we're going to associate ourselves with those past glories. But it's still modernist, it's still clean, it has no decoration, right? It's a modern version of the Colosseum. But think of how different that is from this building, right? And the genius in some ways of Mussolini was to allow for these various elements to compete with each other without deciding on any official fascist culture or fascist style, really. And that kept these elements, just like Hitler, for example, he liked his various subordinates and different, Gauleiters and chancellors to basically constantly be competing with each other, because it would keep him sort of in control, and it would also create this sort of active, and there was a similar element in fascist culture, that you kept the futurists competing against other elements without deciding that it meant that they were constantly contributing to the cause, really. But yeah, it's something that a lot of people don't know, that in fact under Mussolini a lot of modern culture was not only tolerated but patronized and encouraged.
So one of his colleagues at NYU wrote a very famous essay, Fascist Modernities, which actually deals with the fact that fascism presented itself as the peak of modernity, and used the myth of Rome to ground the narration of progress in a sort of eternity or everlastingness. So if you see this, you also see kind of a modern invention of the Roman Empire, pretty much. And this is also the letters of Benito, year 6, and Mussolini. So that's kind of, again, to go back to the use of art and architecture, which is parallel and supportive of an ideology, political ideology.
I also want to add his great book, and if you're interested in this topic, you should definitely read it. But then Iad's book also says a lot about the sort of like contradictions that were inherent in fascist cultural politics, which I think is a lot of what Dr. Merjian is getting at. Even at the level of like what got censored and what didn't. You think of you think of totalitarianism, you think of everything being very set in stone, sort of preordained, but actually a lot of things were not nearly as organized as you think, and decided on the fly. So anyways, it's a very fascinating book also for that. I think that's the book that has the anecdote about Greta Garbo and how the censorship of Greta Garbo and how they just couldn't keep it up. They were like, people Greta Garbo.
Fascism was very much concerned with philosophy, literature, but not necessarily with the design of daily objects, which was considered like a realm that was not to be censored as heavily as...
And it was willing to include a lot of like superficially contradictory cultural phenomenon like under its umbrella.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what's so interesting, is that, and I think in Ben Kia talks a lot about this, that in fact, because it allowed for stuff that was kind of marginally or coded, a lot of people after fascism ended said, well, in fact, what I was writing was really anti-fascist. And that's why my language was coded. And so everyone could get on the bandwagon for having been an anti-fascist precisely because of that sort of ambivalence. That's a terrific point. So in fact, it tolerated, part of it was because it was just completely disorganized and stuff was decided on the fly. Part of it was because it made, this cultural historian Jeffrey Schnapp says that fascism made of paradox something productive. It used that tension between the glories of ancient Rome and modernity and had them constantly in tension as something, we're not contradictory, we're paradoxical. We reconcile these things, we make them work. So there's a constant kind of dialogue between them. And in fact, it was a brilliant way of saying, okay, yeah, we're disorganized and we have these ambivalent things, but they work.
Other questions? Well, there is one element that we discussed earlier in the podcast interview that I invited you to listen to. That will be out probably in a week on the Italian side, Italian Studies webpage. We're discussing about a quote from Pasolini, who is an intellectual who worked in the aftermath of World War II. And Pasolini was describing Italy as a laboratory country. And in this sense, I like the idea of what we discussed today in relation to futurism or fascism, or actually with the evolution of design after World War II and the success of design, as being part of a constant state of laboratory of crisis, if you want, where crisis forces people to constantly invent new solutions, new unpredictable styles, to never stay in a vertical or a horizontal state, a state of stasis, but to keep reinventing new forms of the paradox of the encounter, for example, here of the old and the new, or of opposing forces that form the variety of Italian society. So I like to conclude with this idea in mind. Futurism is a laboratory. It is like a very controversial movement on many aspects. But within this laboratory, there are like some evolutions, some languages that are produced that become part of our daily life. Among them, design these languages or advertising too. So I'd like to conclude with this idea of Italian culture as such, as a laboratory of ideas, and as a place where opposing tensions are brought together and re-elaborated constantly. Thank you for being here tonight and for your wonderful...
Thank you.
Please feel free to ask him
Yeah, I'm
any
here.
more questions.